Hello everyone and welcome to Archaeology. At the time that this video is airing, it will be the holiday of Juneteenth on June 19th, the anniversary of when enslaved African Americans finally learned about emancipation in Texas. In honor of this holiday, I'm going to do two videos on two of the most important rebellions uh, initiated by enslaved African Americans in an attempt to gain freedom from enslavement in the history of the United States. This is the first of those two videos. The subject of today's video is the largest um, rebellion by enslaved African Americans in the history of the United States. Um, the German Coast Uprising of 1811 CE, an event that I guarantee most of you who are watching have not heard of. So, real quick, you might be asking, well, what's the German coast? Why does it, what does it have to do anything with, the United States? Well, you see, the German coast is a specific area in Louisiana, the state of Louisiana in the United States, um, that is, I believe, just a little bit north of the city of New Orleans. All right, so first off, we need to take a look at the sort of historical background and, building blocks, if you will, to the German Coast Uprising. So the the building blocks of what would eventually become known as the German Coast Uprising really start when the French Empire founded the colony of Louisiana in North America in 1702 CE. And then just 16 years afterwards, the French Empire established the city of New Orleans as the capital of the colony of Louisiana in the broader category of what they called New France. Then, just shortly after the founding of the city of New Orleans, the French Empire would first institutionalize the African chattel slavery in Louisiana, and then, of course, would begin importing captured Africans from various countries in West Africa, specifically and most commonly the region and or country of Guinea. Um, Importing them into Louisiana to be used as slave labor on plantations. And then just 1 year after that, the French Empire would approach German citizens in the French-German borderlands known as the Rhineland, uh, conscripting them to come and settle within the colony of Louisiana. Um, Oftentimes drawing them in by giving them tales of riches, which of course would spread around to other German citizens and would become widespread rumors of the riches, if air quotes, if you will, of the colony of Louisiana. And then after that, between the initial recruitments in 1720 CE up until 1731 CE, roughly 400 Germans from that region would come to Louisiana and found settlements on what would become known as the German coast near the city of New Orleans. And here is a picture of their settlements here. Once chattel slavery, African chattel slavery had been institutionalized, and once the German French settlers had really gained a holding in the German coast and in Louisiana as a whole, uh, cotton and indigo would become the main crops of both the colony of Louisiana and specifically the German coast. Indigo being a plant that is used to make purple and blue dyes and clothing. Uh, and here's a picture of sort of that processing methods that they would use. And of course, the enslaved African Americans harvesting said indigo. And of course, cotton, as many of us are aware, is used to make clothing, shirts, blankets. You get the idea. And here is a picture of the enslaved African Americans harvesting that as well. And that here as well. Now, one thing that needs to be mentioned almost immediately in this video is the inherent brutality of the African chattel slavery system. It was, from its very inception, an incredibly horrific and brutal system. Obviously, enslaved African Americans were viewed as nothing more than objects and property. At best, they would be viewed as, quote, like children. But really, more often than not, they were viewed more as objects or property. And then one of the bedrocks of that, based off of the view, obviously incorrect view, but the view of enslaved African Americans being objects and property, was the use of various types of horrific punishments on enslaved African Americans for any offense, both minor and, I don't want to say serious, but you could say, essentially any punishment, minor or serious, if you want to use that phrase. Say, they would be considered serious if an enslaved African American hit or fought back against their master, which I still don't think that that's a serious offense, but that's sort of the view that they had it. But either way, any form of offense could result in a variety of different horrific punishments. You could be tied to a rod or a stick, and beat and torture an enslaved African American for hours, as you can see in this. Obviously, this picture makes it very clear the horrificness of this. And these paddles could have holes in them. With the whole idea being like to uh, lessen air resistance. They can have spikes on them, you name it. But either way, inflicting a great amount of pain onto enslaved African Americans. And of course, everyone knows about whippings and lashings that could permanently scar enslaved African Americans, as you see in this picture. It could go on for hours as well. And what's even more insidious is that oftentimes um, the enslaved African Americans who were being whipped would be whipped by other enslaved African Americans against their will. I do want to make that clear. So, what I mean is the white enslavers would have a, quote, higher ranked enslaved African American whip a another enslaved African American in punishment. Just essentially another form of keeping control and demeaning and humiliating, things like that, on top of inflicting horrific physical pain, which again would scar an individual permanently. And then, of course, enslaved African Americans could be killed for any offense as well. There are plenty examples from plenty of personal accounts of former enslaved African Americans talking about friends and family being shot or being hanged or, other worse fates uh, for any minor offense, period. Just absolutely horrific system across the board. And that's, of course, made even worse by the fact that, again, going back to the idea that they were viewed as objects, not people, uh, they could be sold at any given time for a profit for the enslaved, for the white enslavers. Entire families being sold apart. In fact, there are again multiple examples of uh, enslaved African American individuals, or being sold multiple times during their life and having multiple uh, white enslavers as their masters. Now, eventually, the sort of political situation in the colony of Louisiana would shift a little bit, and this would happen because it would happen due to um, it happened as a side effect. That's the word I'm looking for. It would happen as a side effect of the French and Spanish empires losing the 7 Years' War to the British Empire. Um, Starting with Spain ceding Florida to the British Empire as a result of this defeat. To balance Spain's loss of Florida, it would gain most of what had been French Louisiana from the British Empire. Just 20 or so years after the Spanish Empire gained control of Louisiana, an individual by the name of John St. Malo would escape enslavement and establish a colony of runaway enslaved Africans and African Americans, commonly known as Maroons, in the swamps below New Orleans. This would eventually lead Spanish officials to send the local militia, who would then capture St. Malo and bring him to New Orleans for execution. However, this execution would actually have one could argue, well, you could argue it was sort of expected if you were, say, an enslaved African American or a former enslaved African American. But, in a way, it was also unexpected by the Spanish Empire, and that is that John St. Malo would become a folk hero to African Americans and Africans, both free and enslaved, after his execution, with his execution taking place specifically on June 19th, 1784 CE. Just 10 years later, during the height of the French Revolution, Spanish officials would discover an enslaved African American conspiracy at Point Coup during the Easter holidays and would suppress it before it came to fruition, resulting in 23 executions by hanging. And then the severed heads of the conspirators were displayed on the road to New Orleans, and 31 additional enslaved African Americans and Africans would be flogged and sent to serve hard labor in other Spanish outposts. Right around the same time that the conspirators at Point Coup were being um, punished and executed, white enslavers fleeing the Haitian Revolution would attempt to establish similar lucrative sugarcane plantations on the Gulf Coast, resulting in a dense population of enslaved Africans and African Americans. Um, they would, of course, do this by converting from cotton and indigo plantations to sugarcane plantations, while also replicating the brutal conditions which led to numerous revolts in Haiti, i.e., the high profits from these sugarcane plantations are made by working enslaved Africans and African Americans longer hours and punishing them more brutally than they were already being punished, um, than the already brutal punishments they were receiving, so that they live shorter lives than any other enslaved African and African American society in North America. And this would happen throughout the duration of the Haitian Revolution from 1791 to 1803 CE. I've already done an in-depth video on the Haitian Revolution, which I will include in the iCard. More than half of these enslaved Africans and African Americans had been born outside of Louisiana. Specifically, many of them were warriors captured in West Africa, where various European nations had established slave trade outposts, and where the West African Kingdom of Congo specifically was being ripped apart by several civil wars. So obviously, a lot of these were warriors who had been captured in battle by rival kingdoms of the Kingdom of Congo, and of course by European slave raiders, and shipped to the Americas. Then, at the tail end of these migrations of white enslavers from Haiti, as well as the Haitian Revolution, Napoleon Bonaparte, whom at this point had regained control of Louisiana from the Spanish Empire, would sell the colony of Louisiana to the United States in the very famous event known as the Louisiana Purchase, to pay for his war effort in Haiti, as well as other places, but mainly to pay for his war effort in Haiti. And this would happen in 1803 CE. In addition to all of these events happening, the mixed race Creole and French speaking population would grow markedly, with refugees from Haiti as well as their enslaved African Americans often entering the United States through ports such as New Orleans following the successful Haitian Revolution between 1793 ending somewhere between 1809 to 1810 CE. Now this brings us to our next section, building a rebellion. So the seeds of the German Coast Uprising began when an enslaved African American man by the name of Charles Laurent was made overseer of his enslavers, Manuel Andrew, specifically enslaved African Americans, giving him a certain degree of authority and privilege. However, not exempting him from the same brutal punishments that are the standard of African chattel slavery. Despite the certain degree of authority and privilege afforded to him, Charles Laurent still despised being enslaved. And in fact, it was because of his authority and privilege afforded to him, and also hearing of the successful Haitian Revolution, that Charles Laurent, along with two warriors from the Kingdom of Congo, Cook and Kwamana, would be able to and begin to secretly meet with other enslaved Africans and African Americans to plan an uprising. And this would happen sometime in the early 1800s to, right at the beginning of 1811 CE. Similar to Charles Laurent, Cook, and Kwamana, many of the conspirators were also heavily inspired by the Haitian Revolution. Later reports would describe copies of France's Declaration of the Rights of Man, which was one of the main inspirations for the Haitian Revolution itself. Not the only cause of it, but it was a major inspiration. Being among the possessions of many of the conspirators. Now, you might be asking, how did Charles Laurent, Cook and Kwamana, as well as other conspirators, prepare for this uprising? Like, how were they not found out? Well, they were able to prepare and plan for this uprising during events in holidays such as Epiphany Sunday, which were events where white enslavers allowed enslaved African Americans and, well, of course, free Africans and African Americans to meet, where they would, in theory, party and dance and all kinds of things like that, and have religious celebrations, etc. And the thing is, um, the white American enslavers were actually warned by Spanish citizens and merchants um, of Louisiana that, hey, we've seen things like this before, and only a few years ago, enslaved African Americans and Africans were using, uh, for example, the Point Coup and other events to essentially hide military training, and is a way to sort of secretly plan for uprisings. And the white American enslavers just completely ignored those warnings. So, because of that, Quilmana, Cook, and the conspirators were able to successfully use Epiphany Sunday as well as other holidays uh, to discreetly train militarily for an uprising. I mean, after all, you could hide military drills and uh, other movements like that within dances. Now, this brings us to the meat of our video, the rebellion itself. So, the rebellion began on January 6, 1811 CE, when Charles DeLond, Cook, and Quilmana, along with many of their conspirators, uh, who then went to the Andrew plantation and attacked and badly wounded Manuel Andry, though he was able to escape. But his son, Gilbert Andry, was not, whom they killed. Um, though, of course, as Manuel Andry had escaped, he was able to warn other enslavers. After the attack on the Andry plantation, the rebels would copy the actions of Haitian Revolution leader Jean-Jacques Dessalines, specifically his army in the Haitian Revolution, uh, by donning militia uniforms and, of course, taking muskets and ammunition. So, real quick explanation: what I mean by copying Jean-Jacques Dessalines' actions and the actions of his army is during the Haitian Revolution, which again, I'll have my video on that linked in the iCard. Jean-Jacques Dessalines and his army captured and donned the uniforms of the French military. So this was a very, you know, purposeful copying of the Haitian Revolution. Because again, the Haitian Revolution was one of the main inspirations for Charles DeLond, Cook, Cook and Quilmana, and other conspirators starting this uprising. Afterwards, they would continue on to other plantations, um, specifically the next plantation down the road, where Cook himself would attack and kill white enslaver Francois Trepigny with an axe. And he would be the second and last enslaver killed in the rebellion. Eventually, the rebels, continuing down the road, would stop at the home of the local physician. However, they found him gone, and so Cook would proceed to set that house on fire. And you can see that here, where they're setting the house of that physician on fire. The rebels would then begin marching down the German coast towards New Orleans, burning down any plantation in their path. During this march, 1/3 of the enslaved Africans and African Americans in Louisiana would come to join the rebels, swelling the ranks of the rebels to over 500. And you can see sort of a representation of that here. This is actually, real quick side note, this is actually a reenactment of that, that I believe happens annually in New Orleans. If anyone is, if there are any African Americans in New Orleans, who live in New Orleans or near New Orleans, who can corroborate whether or not this happens yearly, I would very much like to know, because that would be pretty cool to find out about. Here's another example of that, of what that scene would have looked like. And again, this is that same reenactment. All right, so real quick, we're going to, before we move on to the rest of the 1811 German Coast Uprising, we need to take a look at what types of weapons were being used by the rebels. So, of course, as I talked about just a couple of slides ago, at least the sort of inner circle, like the the inner circle, the higher ups, if you will, of this rebellion, led by Charles Dillon, Cook, and Quamana, and their other close inner circle of conspirators, were able to get a hold of some muskets and ammunition from the militia stores of Manuel Andre. And the muskets that they would have found there would have been some variation of a sort of Springfield musket, maybe some newer models from like the 1790s and 1800, but there is also very likely that it would have been a lot of older models that would have still been in decent working use from, like, say, the Revolutionary War era and such. That's hard to corroborate, but generally it would be some form of a Springfield musket, which was the standard musket used by the United States militia and the United States Army. That being said, there was also, it should be noted, there probably wasn't that many of them within this store. I mean, because it's important to remember that the rebels who got a hold of these muskets were generally just small in number. They were a small group of closely knit conspirators. Most of the rebels would have been armed with weapons like sickles for harvesting rice and indigo, sugarcane knives here that would be roughly equivalent to, like, say, a machete, and then other farming implements like hoes and pitchforks. All right, so now we're going to get back into the rebellion itself. In response to this rebellion, General Wade Hampton I and Commodore John Shaw would dispatch 2 companies of militia and 70 troops from both the U.S. and the U.S. Army and the U.S. Navy after the rebels, dispatching them on January 9th, 1811 CE. However, as many of the rebels were trained warriors from the Kingdom of Congo, as well as other kingdoms, African kingdoms on the west coast of Africa, they were able to anticipate the army's approach and were able to successfully avoid the army by fleeing towards the plantation of the enslaver Bernard Bernouillet. Bernoulli, I apologize, I'm sure I butchered that, in search of more favorable terrain. And this was a common tactic of many of the soldiers in the Kingdom of Congo, and really, one could also argue, you know, most armies that in the world were essentially, you choose you choose to only go into battle when when the battle is favorable towards your force. Um, that's a pretty common idea, not even just in the Kingdom of Congo. Um, so that makes sense that these experienced military leaders and warriors would practice that sort of type of strategy. After all, they don't have that many guns, and they were in relatively swampy terrain, which was not conducive to fighting against a trained military force. Uh, However, again, despite successfully escaping the U.S. military, uh, the rebels would encounter a militia of 80 enslavers led by Manuel Andre himself, who took the rebels by surprise and ambushed them, where they used the weather and the fact that the rebels only had a few guns comparatively to the size of their force to their advantage. Um, to give some perspective, it had been raining for several days at that point in time, so it was wet, it was hot, humid. It might have been foggy. There are conflicting reports on whether or not fog had been uh, a factor in this. But either way, the militia of these white enslavers were able to use the weather to their advantage and eventually kill 40 to 50 of the rebels, dispersing the rest on January 10th, 1811 CE. Charles Lalonde himself would be hunted down, captured, and brutally tortured and then burned to death. Meanwhile, the rest of the rebels would be hunted down and put on trial at Destrehan Plantation, which would result in the execution of most of the conspirators on January 11th, 1811 CE. Now, before I move on, I need to give you a trigger warning. The next few slides are going to show disturbing images involving the death and torture of enslaved individuals. So be forewarned, and if you are not comfortable viewing these images, it is perfectly understandable. Just skip ahead just a few minutes. Continuing on, by the end of January 1811 CE, nearly 100 heads would be displayed on the levee from the Place d'Armes in central New Orleans along the river road to the plantation district and Andre's plantation, nearly quadrupling the number of heads nailed to posts in the Point Coup uprising in 1795 CE. And here are some examples here of what that site would have looked like. These are actually memorials that were put in place to memorialize in the modern times to memorialize the this event and the rebels, the people who fought for their freedom during this event. And here are some more examples here. All right, so now it is time to look at the aftermath of the German Coast Uprising of 1811 CE. So for one thing, one of the most immediate sort of consequences and aftermaths of the 1811 German Coast Uprising would be that the enslavers of Louisiana would use propaganda to depict the rebels as mere savage bandits instead of, the brutally enslaved people who were fighting for their freedom. This, in turn, would begin nearly 2 centuries where the German Coast Uprising was either ignored and or relegated to obscurity. Furthermore, the enslavers of Louisiana would invest more money into better trained militias. While that was happening, sort of to complement this training of, this funding of better trained militias, slave patrols would begin surveilling Africans and African Americans, both free and enslaved, with increasing frequency. And also, white enslavers would limit the ability for Africans and African Americans, both free and enslaved, to gather unsupervised. Then one of the biggest consequences of the 1811 German Coast Uprising would be that the federal government would commit to defending the institution of slavery by formally inducting Louisiana into the United States as a slave state on April 30th, 1812 CE. Now, this brings us to our last section, concluding thoughts. So, I want to end this video and also the next video that I'm going to do in honor of Juneteenth with, a variation of this question. Was the German Coast Uprising of 1811 CE successful? And also, does it matter? And the reason I bring these questions to you is because in recent years, this question has been posed by many Black, at least a few Black historians about this idea of like whether or not we should have a metric of whether or not we should be tallying which rebellion by enslaved African Americans to gain their freedom was successful. Because the thing is, one, whether or not an uprising or rebellion by enslaved African Americans is successful is heavily subjective. It depends on what metrics you're using. What you count essentially as a victory or a success. Furthermore, as these African American historians have stated, such as Clint Smith, an African American historian and also host of the YouTube channel Crash Course Black American History, specifically in his own video on the German Coast Uprising of 1811 CE, which I'll also link in the iCard. As he points out, what we should be looking at and what we should be talking about is not whether or not these uprisings and rebellions by enslaved African Americans were successful. We should be talking about the fact that they happened at all, because that's the important part. We can, wax poetic all day about whether or not the German Coast Uprising or, say, the Stonewall Rebellion, in one of my other African American history videos, Black history videos that I've done. We can wax poetic all day about whether or not those events were successful, but that's not the important part. The important part is that enslaved Africans and African Americans put their lives on the line in an attempt to gain freedom. The institution of African chattel slavery was so horrific that they truly believed that the only way out, or one of the only ways out, was to fight their way out of it and gain their freedom. That is what we should be talking about. And again, that is something that many Black and African American historians have pointed out, such as Clint Smith in his video in the iCard. So I just sort of want to leave you with that thought that it's not whether or not a rebellion or uprising by enslaved African Americans and Africans succeeded, it's that these rebellions happened at all. So that ends my video on the 1811 German Coast Uprising. The next video that I'm doing for Juneteenth will be on the bloodiest, not the largest, but the bloodiest rebellion by enslaved African Americans in the history of the United States, Nat Turner's Rebellion. So with that, I hope that you learned a lot in this video. I hope that this really brought to your attention this um this censored is really the only way to go about it. This heavily censored um, event in American history and African American history overall. Um, if you would like me to cover any of the other things that I mentioned in the video in greater detail in later videos, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section. And remember to like, share, and subscribe. And I hope you all have a good day.